Picture this: the world's attention riveted on a single moment, as a major world leader sits beneath the glaring lights of the Oval Office. He leans into the microphone, looks his rival in the eye, albeit through the television screen, and issues a challenge that echoes around the globe. A 50-day countdown. If no agreement is reached, he warns, an economic vice will begin to close, not just on a single nation, but on the entire interconnected web of global commerce. This isn't a scene from a political thriller, it's real life. Former President Donald Trump, addressing the world, announces that NATO will be purchasing American weaponry for Ukraine and issues a stark ultimatum to Russia. Negotiate a ceasefire within 50 days, or the United States will unleash sweeping secondary sanctions and slap a 100% tariff on every Russian product entering American shores. But beyond the headlines and slogans lies a question that touches every corner of the globe. Can this high-stakes ultimatum truly alter the course of a grinding, brutal war? And what, exactly, does it mean for the intricate chessboard of global economics and security? To unpack these questions, we need to journey back through decades, centuries, even, of geopolitics, ambition, and shifting alliances. In the waning days of the Soviet Union, the world witnessed seismic changes. The year was 1991. The Soviet Empire collapsed almost overnight, and Ukraine, long considered Russia's breadbasket and strategic heartland, declared independence. This act sent shockwaves through Moscow. Suddenly, the vast buffer zone that had insulated Russia from the West was gone. The world map was being redrawn, and centuries-old ambitions and anxieties were reawakened. In the years that followed, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, began to edge eastward. Once a defensive bulwark against Soviet expansion, the alliance now welcomed former Eastern Bloc nations into its ranks. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in the late 1990s. For Russia, this was nothing less than an existential threat. The Kremlin watched as, one by one, its former satellites pledged allegiance to an alliance it had once faced across the Iron Curtain. The early 2000s only saw tensions increase. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 thwarted a pro-Russian presidential candidate and signaled Ukraine's Western aspirations. Russia's unease turned to fury in 2008 when NATO declared its intention to eventually include both Ukraine and Georgia. To Moscow, this was a red line crossed. The years that followed saw the annexation of Crimea in 2014, a move that stunned the world and triggered the first major round of Western sanctions. An ongoing conflict ignited in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, with Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian forces locked in a relentless struggle. The United States, under both Republican and Democratic presidents, responded with a complex cocktail of support for Kyiv and pressure on Moscow. Billions of dollars in military and economic aid flowed into Ukraine. Washington imposed sanctions targeting Russian banks, oligarchs, and sectors like energy and defense. But the approach was never simple. Each administration brought its own flavor. Barack Obama's cautious balancing act, Donald Trump's mix of bombast and unpredictability, Joe Biden's efforts to rally allies and escalate pressure. Enter Donald Trump, businessman, showman, disruptor-in-chief. From the start, Trump's foreign policy style was anything but traditional. He questioned the very purpose of NATO, famously calling it obsolete, before later praising its value as allies increased defense spending. He openly discussed the possibility of recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea, a stance unheard of among his predecessors. Yet, he also approved over $1.5 billion in security assistance to Ukraine and greenlit sanctions against Russian oligarchs, including figures like Oleg Deripaska, whose business empire spanned the globe. Trump's approach baffled both allies and adversaries. As Angela Stent from the Brookings Institution observes, Trump's foreign policy is often driven by personal relationships and short-term gains rather than long-term strategic goals. This ambiguity, she argues, creates instability, openings for negotiation perhaps, but also risks of misunderstanding and escalation. Fast forward to the present. The war in Ukraine has dragged on, with no end in sight. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, has intensified air attacks on Ukrainian cities. Night after night, the skies over Kyiv and other urban centers are filled with the roar of missiles and the ominous buzz of drones. Civilians huddle in metro stations and basements, hoping that modern defense systems will shield them from destruction. The air defense provided by American-made Patriot missile systems offers hope, but each missile comes with a staggering price tag, estimated at around $4 million United States dollars. Trump's latest announcement is a dramatic pivot. He promises billions more in military hardware for Ukraine, including those coveted Patriots. But he also introduces a twist. He holds back on the harshest economic measures, offering a 50-day window, a chance for Putin to come to the negotiating table, under threat of unprecedented sanctions. Some see this as a masterstroke of brinkmanship. Others, like military analyst Matthew Saville of the Royal United Services Institute, warn that Putin will use at least 49 of those days to continue attacking Ukraine, potentially escalating violence before the deadline strikes. On the streets of Kyiv, reactions are mixed. Some, like Denis Podilchuk, a lifelong resident, voice cautious optimism. "I really hope that these 50 days will finally be real pressure on Russia." Others, scarred by years of broken promises and shifting Western priorities, remain skeptical. "We have waited for so long," says Olena Karpushna, a mother of two. "The fact they are giving Patriots is very good because sitting at night in the hallways and fearing for your child is not good. But we have heard deadlines before." Meanwhile, European leaders face their own dilemmas. For decades, Europe has relied on Russian energy, gas, oil, coal, to power its industries and heat its homes. Even last year, nearly 1/5 of the European Union's natural gas imports came from Russia. The threat of secondary sanctions penalties not just on Russia, but on any nation or company that continues doing business with Moscow, could send shockwaves through European economies. For countries like Germany, France, and Italy, the stakes are enormous. Inflation, already a concern, could spiral as energy prices soar. Factories might shut their doors, and families could face difficult winters. But the impact wouldn't stop at Europe's borders. Secondary sanctions, if enforced, would affect major economies across Asia as well. China and India, for example, have become key buyers of discounted Russian oil in the wake of Western embargoes. Both nations have their own strategic calculations. For China, cheap Russian energy supports industrial growth and energy security. For India, Russian crude is a way to keep fuel affordable for its vast population. If the United States moves forward with secondary sanctions, these relationships could be tested to the breaking point. Yet, despite the gravity of Trump's threat, some experts doubt its effectiveness. Michael McFaul, former United States ambassador to Russia, warns that Trump's ambiguity undermines the credibility of United States deterrence in Eastern Europe. He points out that without clear, consistent enforcement, threats risk becoming empty gestures. Angela Stent echoes this concern, noting that when policy is driven by personal relationships and short-term headlines, the risks multiply. In Moscow, the mood is tense, but not panicked. Some Russian elites interpret the 50-day window as an opportunity, a last chance to make military gains before the economic hammer falls. Ultra-nationalist voices, such as philosopher Alexander Dugin, have called for a final liberation of contested Ukrainian territories, urging the Kremlin to exploit the window while it lasts. Social media channels buzz with speculation. Will the Russian military escalate its campaign? Will the West really follow through on its threats? Russian investors, meanwhile, sent a different signal. Following Trump's announcement, Russian stocks actually rose. To some, this suggests that the markets doubt the West's resolve, or believe that loopholes and workarounds will soften the blow of any new sanctions. It's a reminder that economic warfare is as much about perception as it is about policy. For Ukraine, the next 50 days are likely to be among the most perilous since the conflict began. Each night, hundreds of Russian drones, often so-called Shahed and Geran models, swarm across the skies. Ukraine's interception rate, experts say, is typically around 85%, but with relentless barrages, dozens of drones still break through, causing destruction and terror. Patriot missile systems, while effective against large missiles, are wildly uneconomical for shooting down small, cheap drones. Ukrainian forces must rely on a patchwork of small arms, domestically produced drones, and ingenuity to defend their cities. The stakes for the global economy are equally high. A 100% tariff on Russian goods entering the United States would disrupt trade flows worth tens of billions of dollars annually, affecting not just energy, but metals, fertilizers, and raw materials vital to industries worldwide. The threat of secondary sanctions could entangle European, Asian, and even Middle Eastern companies that do business with Russia. Supply chains, already strained by the aftermath of the COVID pandemic and ongoing geopolitical rivalries, could be thrown into fresh turmoil. Consider this. In the last year alone, global supply chains have seen disruptions from the Red Sea crisis, droughts affecting the Panama Canal, and semiconductor shortages. The addition of a United States-led embargo on all Russian goods and secondary sanctions on third-party traders would amplify volatility. Prices for everything from gasoline to bread to car batteries could rise. Small businesses might find it harder to source components. Households could see higher heating bills and grocery bills. This is not just speculation. Previous rounds of sanctions, from the first measures after Crimea in 2014 to the sweeping packages imposed after the full-scale invasion in 2022, have already had measurable effects. According to a recent study, sanctions have decreased Russia's trade with sanctioning states, but the impact has varied across countries. Some European Union members, for example, have found ways to maintain limited commercial ties, while others have cut off nearly all access to Russian markets. The United States Congress, in a rare show of bipartisan unity, has often pushed for even tougher measures than the administration itself. A group of senators has advocated for a 500% tariff on Russian goods, a move that would virtually eliminate all legal trade. Trump, however, has chosen the 100% figure, at least for now, leaving room for further escalation if Moscow refuses to budge. Sanctions, of course, are a double-edged sword. They can weaken an adversary's economy, but they also carry costs for the enforcer and its allies. European industries dependent on Russian raw materials could suffer. Consumers worldwide might see ripple effects in prices and availability. And enforcing secondary sanctions, tracking every shipment, every financial transaction, requires vast resources and cooperation across borders. Yet the alternative is no less fraught. If Russia is allowed to continue its campaign without meaningful consequences, the norms underpinning the post-World War II international order, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of law could erode further. Other authoritarian leaders might be emboldened to pursue their ambitions, calculating that the West's resolve is weak and its unity fleeting. So what comes next? There are several possible scenarios, each with its own risks and opportunities. First, Trump's gamble could pay off. The threat of overwhelming economic pain might push Putin to the negotiating table, leading to a ceasefire and, perhaps, a pathway to peace. This would require not just Russian acquiescence, but also guarantees for Ukraine's security and sovereignty. A tall order, given the deep distrust on both sides. Second, the gambit could backfire. Sensing a closing window, Moscow might intensify its military campaign, seeking to seize as much territory as possible before sanctions bite. The result could be a surge in violence, more civilian casualties, and a deepening humanitarian crisis. The risk of accidental escalation would rise, especially if fighting spills over into neighboring countries or targets Western-supplied weapons. Third, the world might witness a prolonged standoff. Putin could call Trump's bluff, betting that divisions within the West, between the United States and Europe, or between hawks and doves in Washington, will prevent full enforcement of sanctions. In this scenario, the war drags on, with periodic escalations and temporary lulls, as each side tests the other's resolve. These scenarios are not mutually exclusive. History is filled with examples of conflicts that began with ultimatums and deadlines, only to spiral in unexpected directions. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, for example, was resolved in 13 tense days, but only after bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Balkan conflicts of the 1990s, on the other hand, dragged on for years, despite countless ceasefire proposals and diplomatic efforts. Expert voices offer varied perspectives. Arisia Lucevic, a researcher at Chatham House, warns that the lack of a clear United States strategy on Ukraine creates opportunities for Russia to exploit divisions within the transatlantic alliance. Dmitry Tretin, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center, argues that Trump's focus on bilateral deals weakens NATO and gives Moscow leverage. Daniel Fried of the Atlantic Council insists that secondary sanctions are essential to deterring Russian aggression, but they require consistent enforcement and international cooperation. The international community is not standing still. Behind closed doors, legal teams are gathering evidence of war crimes and financial networks. International organizations, such as the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions, are formulating new strategies to choke off illicit flows and pressure Putin to end the invasion. Even as politicians debate tariffs and deadlines, the machinery of accountability grinds forward, aiming to ensure that justice outlasts any political deal. For ordinary people, the stakes are both global and personal. In Berlin, a small business owner wonders if rising energy costs will force layoffs. In Beijing, a factory manager calculates whether continued trade with Russia risks American penalties. In Boston, A family wonders how much their heating bill will rise next winter. The interconnected nature of the 21st century economy means that distant conflicts can have immediate, tangible impacts on daily life. For households, the effects may be felt most acutely in fuel and food prices. If sanctions disrupt the flow of Russian fertilizers or wheat, global food markets could tighten, driving up costs for staple goods. If energy imports are further restricted, heating and electricity bills could climb. The lesson is clear. In an interconnected world, political brinkmanship has local consequences. So as the world counts down Trump's 50-day clock, everyone has a stake in the outcome. Will this be the move that finally breaks the deadlock and brings peace to Ukraine? Or will it trigger a fresh wave of violence, economic turmoil, and uncertainty? History suggests that Vladimir Putin does not easily yield to ultimatums. Previous deadlines have come and gone, with little to show but continued conflict and suffering. Yet, the scale of the threatened economic response is unlike anything seen before. If enforced in full, it could isolate Russia from key markets, force painful choices in capitals from Brussels to Beijing, and reshape global trade patterns for years to come. The risks are enormous, but so too are the potential rewards, if the world can summon the unity and resolve to see it through. In the end, the story of Trump's ultimatum is about more than just two leaders locked in a test of wills. It is about the power of economic tools in modern warfare, the fragility of alliances, and the unpredictable ripple effects of decisions made in distant capitals. It is a reminder that, in the age of globalization, no nation and no individual is truly insulated from the shocks of international crisis. If you want to keep up with the real forces shaping our world, now is the time to subscribe, like, and join the discussion below. What's your perspective? Is this bold move the turning point in a long, grinding conflict, or just another headline in an endless geopolitical standoff? Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the turning points that define the global economy. Until then, remember,